remains that washed up on the shore in 1934, about 23 feet or so long. You'll notice the individual is standing to the right there. And all of this, of course, is horse feathers. There are explanations for this, besides there being monsters. Well, even with rampant skepticism, many of the scientific journals run accounts of these monsters. A detailed account of a run-in by Norwegians with a 50-foot sea serpent was in an early zoological issue of 1847. One of the men angered it by shooting it, and they just barely escaped to shore in a small boat. And the next year, there were other sightings and another shooting scene in a larger ship like this, which brought the attention of a 130-foot monster to the ship crew in question here. Well, one of these zoologist articles brought on response from crew members who'd seen sea monsters and explained that their officers would not record the incidents for obvious reasons. Well, some of the ancients were not quite so close-minded. The Romans, for example, had a number of monster subjects shown up in their mosaics, like this one. This one is from about the 2nd century A.D. It's called the Beasts of Nodens. The ancient mariners called the giant squids the krakens. In 1861, the French vessel Corvette battled with one of these giant squids, and the squid took many cannonballs and harpoons with very little effect. And it was one of several early encounters with these huge squids. Now, typically, shore authorities put it on the books as a mass hallucination. Actually, there are more sightings inland than there are at sea. There are several sea serpents around Chesapeake Bay, for example. It's on the Potomac River, and they've been sighted off and on over the years, and residents say that they're 30 to 40 feet long. In April 1983, one was actually videotaped, according to Fate magazine of 483. Lake Champlain has a similar monster that's protected by Vermont laws, passed in 1982. It's been about 50 foot long, according to reports, and has his neck as thick as an oil drum. It's been seen off and on for many years, according to the observers there and residents. Well, the submerged bodies of these monsters is tremendous in comparison to the little necks, which are most frequently seen. This is an actual photo of one. It was taken in April '83. And as we mentioned, Robert Frew videotaped one of the monsters with his family. And the Smithsonian scientists simply conceded that the tape seemed authentic, but the life form was not identifiable. This is in May 31, 1982. Well, many North American lakes have monsters and serpents of other types in them. There have been hundreds of sightings. Typical was a 70-foot long snake-like creature sighted and later filmed as it swam under a boat of the filmer, and it was at Okanagan Lake in British Columbia. It was described in a November '78 Smithsonian magazine. But like the plesiosaurs that we spoke of earlier in the Belgian Congo and the inland river lakes of Africa, most of the American varieties and the North American varieties of lake monsters are tame, and relatively few have ever upset boats or fishermen or harmed human beings. Well, today even scientists are now having to give up their skepticism about tales of giant eels living in the ocean. A Danish biologist dredged up a 6-foot eel larva from the sea, which meant the mother of this larva had to be around 100 feet long. And that, my friends, is a long eel. For hundreds of years, monsters have been bending deep sea hooks up to several feet long. And only lately have we been scanning the ocean with various devices down deep where these monsters live. And of course, eyewitnesses have been seeing these monsters for centuries, except there have been no evidences. Well, today such evidence is accumulating. Now, the Deepster is a vessel owned by Westinghouse that was exploring the ocean at 6,000 feet in the San Diego Trough, and suddenly a monster fish confronted it with eyes as big as dinner plates. And there were 2 sightings of this 30-foot monster in the early 80s. And what else is lurking at the depth is just hard to speculate on at this point. Well, giant land snakes have long been spoken of by natives and explorers in the Latin areas and jungle areas of Africa, and some of them have eaten livestock and humans, if reports are correct. A huge specimen was supposedly photographed by one Belgian military aviator. It was detailed in a 1969 Pursuit magazine. In the early 60s, Italian researchers Falchi actually photographed an anaconda that was around 120 feet and weighed a full ton. And it had just eaten 2 calves for lunch, according to the Venezuelan Daily Journal. Well, while the large snakes and water monsters are fairly numerous over the face of the globe, there's one incredible species of ground monster that is truly rare, and it's the huge worms. And in 1878, Nature magazine, there was an article told of giant worms in the highland of certain southern provinces of Brazil. And this Minhacoa has been seen on numerous occasions, and its burrowing trenches were not unusual in the region. And they frequently start burrowing from marshes during the rainy season and excavate inland. Now, their head has a snout somewhat like a pig, and the bodies are armed like the scales of an armadillo of one species, only they're large enough to uproot young trees. An 1878 Nature magazine told of similar underground monsters in Central America. In 1929, an earthworm longer than a man was found, according to collected data by Wilkins, and its eggs were 3 inches long and a greenish translucent color. And of course, in the mines of the world, there are occasionally found a type of armored worm that has a small, tiny body, but it lives hundreds of feet below the surface. And an 1881 Scientific American has an article on this. And other worms are unusual too, and small black snow worms have been described at very high altitudes by many climbers and explorers over the years. Well, in the same areas of the world where the giant monsters and worms and snakes live, there are, of course, the gorillas. And in an early biological journal, a naturalist named Bleckenow told of a giant gorilla killing one of his companions, and it was the head of the Rio Mopan in Yucatan. It lived in a cave that the naturalist actually found, but he could find no Indian to aid him, and he had to return to civilization without this monster. Now, a few years later in the same area, Mayan women were sometimes molested and scared by a gigantic gorilla creature. And in this illustration, it's a little overdone as to size, but there does exist many records of such encounters. Harold Wilkins tells of a true King Kong who attacked and killed a number of cattle near Aldeas on the Rio Araguaina in 1937. It was estimated to be about 12 foot high, and in a few nights of raids the whole village deserted the area. Well, Spanish records tell of children who were a cross between Central American apes and native women, and these children were hairy and animal-like, could not speak. And this is in the Spanish records. And at the turn of the century, Wilkins met an Irishman who told of shooting an 8-foot ape who was charging him. Another Latin species that was unusual was seen around 1577 by Jean Lirius, and he was with an admiral on an island in the Bay of Rio de Janeiro when they ran into a huge lizard that was bigger than they were. And after looking each other over, both parties separated peacefully, from the accounts that were made later. Now, when a Dutch East India sloop reached an island near Madagascar in 1696, they found birds' nests on the ground many feet in diameter. And Captain Cook discovered similar nests, 26 feet in circumference, on his first voyage into the South Pacific area. An 18th century English traveler in New Siberia mentioned bird tracks 3 feet long and stray feathers 3 or 4 inches in diameter. Now, from such descriptions, these evidently were offshoots of the moa bird. Now, back in the 1800s, there were a number of reports of extinct moa birds being seen in Australia and New Zealand. And Zoologist magazine of the period gives examples. And Popular Science Monthly of 1875 told of a New Zealander who supposedly captured one in a remote pass in New Zealand. It was 8 feet tall. A Perth museum has an egg of one of these giant birds that's almost a foot long. Well, in the early tales of Sinbad, there's mention made of the giant wingless bird called the roc, similar to the moa, and it's Marco Polo that actually saw a bird that could have been a roc off the coast of Madagascar. It looked like this drawing and stood around 7 feet high. These Apiornis, as they were called, were supposed to be extinct for millions of years, yet numerous sightings were made in ancient times. Well, in the Illustrated London News of February 9th in 1856, it was told of finding a huge goose-like monster while a couple of miners were excavating a railroad tunnel. And this monster was black, oily, and after uttering hoarse screeches, it died on them. Experts said it belonged to the genus Petrodactylus anus, pterodactyl family. It was blasted from a 1,000,000-year-old rock, and no one had the slightest clue of how it could have hibernated that long. But obviously there were other unhatched creatures that could follow its example across the globe, as we pointed out before. And some other monster birds of this type have been known in the lore of explorers and natives in the very remote regions of this planet. According to a newspaper account of April 1890, a couple of cowboys ran into a huge bird-like creature in the barren desert regions near Tombstone, and after shooting it with their rifles, they cleaned the body and claimed it was 92 foot long, and had bat-like wings that were 160 foot long, and they arrived with some of the bird, tip of the wing and such, as proof in Tucson, Arizona. And the Tombstone, Arizona paper at the time mentioned